Over 1,000 new COVID-19 cases in the city. Legislative amendment that will entitle employees to sick paid leave if they're subject to quarantine or isolation. And the UK's Rwanda asylum flight canceled after a European court granted injunctions.
Good evening and welcome. Hong Kong today logged more than 1,000 new COVID infections, the highest daily tally since mid-April, including 76 imported cases.
Outbreaks were reported at a school and residential care homes. Christy Khan reports.
The health authorities today started to report local and imported cases separately. When asked by reporters in a press conference why, the health official said the practice is now required, adding it is useful to assess the local pandemic situation.
This is to enhance the risk communication. We separate these two sets of figures so that the public can more understand how the cases are distributed among these two categories.
Schools today reported 147 COVID cases. The health authorities said a 17-year-old student from Pui Ching Middle School was suspected to have the BA.2.12.1 subvariant. She attended a dinner gathering with some 60 students and teachers last Friday. Later, 5 other students who were also present at the gathering were infected with the virus, 3 of them sitting at the same table with the 17-year-old student. All students on the same table are now doing home quarantine, and the rest of attendees will not be allowed to go to school this week.
We believe that there might have been some transmission going on during the dinner gathering because we picked up cases from the same table.
Meanwhile, authorities said a cluster emerged at the Christian Family Service Center, Shen Chun House, with 10 residents coming down with COVID. The remaining residents will be sent to Asia World Expo to undergo quarantine. Additionally, 4 carers from 3 other care homes across the city were infected with COVID. The authorities reported that an 83-year-old COVID patient passed away in a public hospital yesterday, bringing the overall death toll to 9,179 during the 5th wave. Christy Khan, TVB News.
Lawmakers today passed an amendment to the employment ordinance that will entitle eligible employees to paid sick leave if they are subject to quarantine or isolation. But the regulation is not retroactive. The debate was sparked after many local residents were put into quarantine after getting infected with COVID or subject to compulsory lockdown. An anonymous vote was held in LegCo. More than half of the lawmakers present voted in favor of the amendments. Under the amendment, it will not be considered unreasonable if an employee who refused to get jabbed without sufficient medical reasons is laid off. Starting Monday, Canada will suspend its requirement to be vaccinated against COVID-19 for domestic travel and to work in the civil service. The government said the move is due to Canada's high vaccination rate and a decrease in coronavirus infections. Some 32 million, or nearly 90% of eligible Canadians, are vaccinated. The mandate was also suspended for people departing from Canada. International travelers to the country, however, will still be required to show proof of vaccination. The mandates for domestic travel and the civil service have been in place since October 2021. That was about a month after Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau won a 3rd election, in part by promising to take a hard line on vaccinations. Britain will fight any legal challenges to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda. This after the European Court of Human Rights, or ECHR, issued last-minute injunctions to stop the first deportation flight going ahead.
Therese Coffey, the Works and Pensions Minister, said plans for the next flight are being prepared. Matthew Bray reports.
This charter plane was due to take a handful of migrants to Rwanda, but as the day wore on, it stayed on the tarmac. European judges at the ECHR granted injunctions that stopped the flight minutes before it was due to take off for East Africa. Britain is part of the 46-nation Council of Europe under which the court falls. The UK government has been forced to fight a series of legal challenges in London courts, with some 30 individuals winning cases that could avoid deportation on health or rights grounds. Prime Minister Boris Johnson said it may be necessary to change laws in order to uphold the deportation policy.
Certainly the case that the legal fraternity, sorority, whatever, the legal world is very good at picking up ways of trying to stop the government from upholding what we think is a sensible law. Now, will it be necessary to change some laws to help us as we go along? It may very well be, and all these options are under constant review.
Official figures, likely an underestimate, say 28,500 people were found arriving in small boats last year, mainly from France. Rwandan officials say they are offering a home and opportunities under the new agreement with Britain.
The people who live in this country will be given several legal avenues for legal residence. The primary one will be to be granted refugee status. If not refugee status, they will be granted residence on other grounds, such as migrant worker status and other.
China's foreign ministry at a daily briefing urged the United Kingdom to stop disregarding human rights standards and humanitarianism. Matthew Bray, TVB News.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said she's nearly ready with plans to hold a second independence referendum without the consent of the British government. Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish National Party, said she is aiming to hold a vote by the end of 2023. This despite the fact that British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has refused to issue a Section 30 order to allow one. Sturgeon said work was underway on how to proceed lawfully. The British government contests the Scottish Parliament has the power to grant such a vote. In 2014, Scots voted against independence 55% to 45%. Sturgeon, however, believes she has a mandate to deliver independence.
I was re-elected as First Minister just over 1 year ago on a clear commitment to give the people of Scotland the choice of becoming an independent country. And the people of Scotland elected a Scottish Parliament with a decisive majority in favour of both independence and the right to choose. The Scottish Parliament, therefore, has an indisputable democratic mandate, and we intend to honour that.
A regional official in eastern Ukraine says Russian troops control about 80% of the fiercely contested eastern city of Severodonetsk.
Officials say efforts continue to get Ukrainians evacuated despite having all 3 bridges leading out of the city destroyed. In the past few weeks, Russian forces have pressed hard to capture Ukraine's eastern industrial Donbass area, made up of the regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. But Ukraine shows little inclination to obey a Russian ultimatum to surrender the eastern city of Severodonetsk. This morning, Russia told Ukrainian forces holed up in a chemical plant in the shattered city to lay down arms. After the deadline passed, the city's mayor said Russian forces were trying to storm the city from several directions, but Ukrainian forces continued to defend it and were not completely cut off. He added the escape routes are dangerous, but there are some. Plans announced by Moscow to open a humanitarian corridor for civilians holed up in the plant were disrupted. Russian-backed separatists blamed shelling by Ukraine. While civilian evacuations from the surrounding Luhansk region continue, about 12,000 people remain in Severodonetsk. In another late-night address, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky encouraged his people to hold strong, reminding them the enemy is also suffering losses. He again pleaded for more and faster deliveries of Western arms. Western countries have promised NATO's standard weapons, including advanced U.S. rockets, but deploying them and transitioning to new supplies and weapons systems is taking time. Meanwhile, the conflict is sending grain prices soaring. Some 2.4 million hectares of winter crops worth more than $4 billion will remain unharvested in Ukraine because of Russia's invasion, according to the Ukrainian Agriculture Ministry. U.S. President Joe Biden said Tuesday that temporary silos would be built along the border with Ukraine, including in Poland, in a bid to help export more grain and address a growing global food crisis. Biden said he is working with other European countries to unlock the grain and bring it to market to bring down food prices. Still ahead on tonight's news, a Consumer Council warning about high sodium and fat levels of most sandwich bread on the market. Coroner's court rules a Filipino domestic helper who complained of being overworked died of natural causes. And a New York court rules against an animal rights group trying to free an elephant from a zoo.
Welcome back to TVB News. The Consumer Council warns against the high sodium and fat levels of most sandwich breads sold on the market, with some having false nutrient content labels or none at all.
The watchdog also wants the government to introduce regulations for oximeters, which measure blood oxygen levels. They've grown in popularity during the pandemic. Jackie Lynn reports.
When it comes to your choice of daily bread, take it with a grain of salt, quite literally. This as the Consumer Council looked into 28 samples of prepackaged white bread and wheat bread. Among them, the sample from Don Don Donki recorded the highest level of trans and saturated fatty acids, likely due to its high percentage of butter and cream. It has a tenfold difference than this brand from Simply Life. It has the lowest level of total fat content, but the highest sodium content among the samples. Though it hasn't reached the threshold deemed as high in sodium, eating 2 slices could reach more than 20% of the daily intake limit for adults recommended by the World Health Organization.
When the industry is so competitive, want to make the bread more attractive, they may add a little bit more salt into their own bread. If you don't add salt into the bread, the taste of it may be a little bit loose or maybe a little bit flat.
And pricier doesn't mean better. The most expensive brand sets you back $26 a slice. The cheapest one costs just $1, but with a higher overall score in their nutrient content. Issues too in labeling. Nearly half of the samples saw a discrepancy between their actual and claimed nutrient contents. The fat content in this brand is found to be 90% higher than is stated. 4 bread samples didn't even indicate their nutrient contents. With the increasing demand for oximeters during the pandemic, the Consumer Council also called on the government to regulate these blood oxygen detection devices. This as the watchdog received at least 17 related complaints this year. As oximeters for non-medical use don't have to be scrutinized by medical institutions, the Council says their accuracy could be affected by factors such as shaky, cold, and clammy hands or overly long fingernails. So patients should not rely solely on the oximeters as health indicators. Jackie Lin, TV News.
Lawmakers today passed a government restructuring proposal, which includes 2 new policy bureaus and new deputies to the Chief Secretary for Administration, the Financial Secretary, and the Justice Secretary. The arrangement will be gazetted on Friday and take effect on July 1st. Meanwhile, a LegCo panel has approved the addition of a Chief Labor Officer post to the Labor Department with a yearly salary of $1.9 million. The job duties have mainly to do with the registration of trade unions and the amendment of relevant ordinances to ensure the unions comply with the national security law.
In 2017, a Filipino domestic helper died in her employer's apartment after notifying about her resignation, citing that she was overworked. A coroner's inquest into her death began last Tuesday.
Today, after hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously returned a verdict of death by natural causes. Timothy Lee has more.
The 7-day inquest into the death of Filipino domestic helper Leonida Arquilas Quinto finally reached its end. In late 2016, 46-year-old Quinto came to the city to work for a family of 4 in Meifu. She resigned 3 months later after complaining of being overworked and died at her employer's home on April 4, 2017. Coroner Stanley Ho took into account the limited evidence provided. He explained to the jury about the importance of determining Quinto's place of death. However, while the A&E doctor involved said Quinto was confirmed dead at the hospital, the ambulance staff showed evidence that she had already died hours before being sent to the A&E department. The coroner said there were not enough grounds to determine that mental stress had induced Quinto's organ dysfunction. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously found that Quinto had died of natural causes. The jurors also advised that domestic worker employment agencies should keep all medical and relevant records of their helpers for the duration of employment. Timothy Lee, TVB News.
Beijing has talked up support for Nansha and Guangdong province with a fresh development blueprint released by the State Council yesterday.
Sharon Tang spoke to former Hong Kong Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying to find out more about the booming port city.
What lies ahead of Nansha? Here are a few takeaways from Leung Chun-ying, a consultant for the Consultative Committee on Guangdong-Hong Kong Cooperation, Guangzhou Nansha.
You run a business in Nansha, or you have an employment in Nansha with employment income, you essentially pay the same amount of tax as if you were in Hong Kong. It has manufacturing, it has science and technology, it has service sector, it even has high-grade agricultural activities.
Yesterday, the State Council unveiled a document covering Hong Kong, Macau and Nansha, detailing how residents could benefit from increased cooperation. Leung stressed these cities are not meant to be seen as competitors.
Competition is not a bad thing. This is not meant to be sort of negative competition. There is a greater degree of division of responsibilities. They have different targets, and there are different emphasis.
The late billionaire Henry Fok laid out his vision for the development of Nansha back in the 1980s. The transport system in Nansha has come a long way since then, and by 2025, a high-speed rail line connecting Hong Kong, Shenzhen and Nansha is expected to be completed. Leung added there are measures that specifically target Hong Kongers and their families.
The mutual recognition of professional qualifications, engineers, architects, surveyors. We are building the school and is nearing completion, a Hong Kong school that will be run on Hong Kong syllabus with IB and the GCSE parts as well. That also solves the problem of Hong Kong families who want to relocate from Hong Kong to Guangzhou, Nansha.
As for how all these can be implemented, with quarantine-free cross-border travel still nowhere in sight, Leung said one of the prerequisites is for the public to cope with the government's anti-COVID policies.
No one wants to sit inside a quarantine hotel room for 14 days. So instead of trying to find a crystal ball to tell us when the boundary between Hong Kong and the mainland will open again, I think there are things that we can do in addition to what governments can do.
Sharon Tang, TVB News.
Well, to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the establishment of the SAR, Hong Kong broke the international record for creating the world's largest hanging lantern. A work 2 years in the making, the lantern was made by more than 1,000 mainland primary and secondary students and incarcerated youths in Hong Kong. After much hard work, the 13-meter tall and 9-meter wide Chinese lantern was created. The design aims to show the spirit of Hong Kong's athletes and the city's unique culture. And visitors can view the lantern in Central between July and October.
New York State's highest court has ruled against an animal rights group trying to free an elephant from a zoo. 4 years ago, the Florida-based advocacy group Non-Human Rights Project began asking New York courts to release Happy the elephant to one of 2 U.S. elephant sanctuaries. It argued the 51-year-old animal is an autonomous, cognitively complex elephant worthy of the right reserved in law for a person and should be freed. The Bronx Zoo argued Happy is neither illegally imprisoned nor a person, but a well-cared-for animal. In a 5-2 decision, the State Court of Appeals ruled Happy does not meet the definition of a person who is being illegally confined. It said granting freedom to Happy could have an enormous destabilizing impact and generate a flood of petitions to free other animals. That's the news. Thanks for watching.
Good night.